asking me to address the academy. Okay, yeah, so that's the group, some of whose work I'll talk about, and some of whom I see are in the audience. And really, essentially all my work is with these and these alumni from the group. I'll mention them individually wherever their work comes up. So I'll tell you the systems we're going to be talking about. As this is supposed to be an overview talk to the academy, I'll tell you a little bit about old work also, and then talk about our current research. I realized a little late that I have to finish in 35 minutes, so I'll skip whole chunks of the talk altogether. So the kind of system we're talking about, as Chandan told you, is collections of particles, each of which is powered in some way. It could be the cells of a tissue, organisms in a group of organisms, subcellular power-consuming components like motors inside a cell, or artificial realizations like this thing that I'll say something about during the talk. And they can be operating in a variety of domains. They can be in a fluid medium, or they can be on a surface, and the dynamics becomes very different in these different cases, as you will see. And there's also interesting for those of you, hopefully there are some physics people in the audience, not from my line of physics but others. There are interesting connections between active matter systems and very different driven quantum systems as well, which I won't have time to talk about, but which is all the more reason to pay attention to this field. I think I have to stand on this side. Yeah. My motivation for studying these problems, even though the origin of these systems comes from physics, come from biology, my motivation of studying these problems is that they present interesting questions in the fundamental physics of systems very far from thermal equilibrium. So, back fairly early in the game, I wrote a review which has proved to have some influence in the field, where I kind of made a manifesto where I said, look, we have to study this system. So the big hope is that we'll understand the fundamental laws governing the statistics of steady states, what phases you can have, what phases can coexist, how things relax. All the questions you ask about statistical and thermodynamic systems at equilibrium, we'd like to do the same kind of thing for these homogeneously driven systems in which each particle is taking up and converting free energy into systematic movement. And I've sort of made most of my living being able to write down descriptions of complicated systems without understanding their fine details very well, only keeping track of conservation laws and symmetries, in the same spirit as you write down the equations of hydrodynamics without really knowing about molecules. So this has been, so I'll tell you some stories from this general endeavor. The subject is really interesting for another reason, which is that actually long before we got into the game, very distinguished fluid dynamicists had been worrying about this problem. And they wrote a beautiful paper, more than 50 years ago, which sank without a trace. Nobody really paid attention to it because somehow the theoretical machinery to do hydrodynamics for complicated systems was not yet available. But it's a beautiful paper and should be read, and it specifically says that the sorts of phenomena we're talking about should operate at the cellular level in living systems. So they anticipated actually several of the models that are now associated with other people in the field. All right, so the way this game has sort of many starts, one of which was a model attributed to Vicek because it was invented by a guy named Reynolds, in which you had agents trying to align with each other and which would undergo a phase transition from random motion to coherent motion if they aligned accurately enough and each of them had enough neighbors. And this is a bona fide phase transition. You can measure it in computer simulations. You can write down simple theories of its properties. And one of our entries into this field was to ask, well, you've written this down in a rule-based way. What if it was taking place in a fluid? In that case, each agent trying to adjust its direction of motion would disturb the fluid in doing so because it has to change its momentum. How does that change? So we showed that it changes everything. The presence of a viscous fluid, aligned states in a fluid, if the fluid is viscous, are basically unavoidably unstable. We then showed much more recently that if you take into account the inertia of the fluid, you can actually overcome this transition and you can have organized state, which kind of explains why you can have ordered flocks of large, fast organisms. This subject actually, this particular instability spawned a huge collection of experiments which were very exciting, which I won't have time to tell you about, and even led to predictions of, there it is again, of flow inside a cell. And this movie, for some reason, maybe it will work if I restart it. Yeah, predicted that if you place a cell on a fixed geometry, the nucleus will start rotating. So all kinds of fun and games, but this is very old work, and I'll just go on. Another bit of early work that has proved very influential is that if you have aligned states of things that aren't moving, these kinds of rods whose heads and tails are the same, they form states of the same type as you see in liquid crystalline displays, and they have little structural defects, some of which have a nose, and we predicted should therefore propel themselves in the direction of that nose. This idea again has turned out to be influential in problems related to developmental biology, to mound formation in cell cultures and so forth. That again is an ongoing story which has connections to problems as diverse as tissue growth, hydra regeneration, and so forth. Okay, now that's the end of the introduction. I'm not doing so badly. I'll come to our current research. There's one problem whose title is fun, but which I won't have time to go into, which I'll recommend you read about. I'll tell you about the physics of non-reciprocal interactions and their implications, and some rather odd mechanics of active chiral systems. Okay, non-reciprocal interactions is something we're all familiar with because human interactions are non-reciprocal, because affection isn't necessarily mutual. This sort of phenomenon takes place abundantly across the living world, not only in really sentient creatures, but even in much, in signaling interactions in cell biology and so forth. This type of interaction, what's important to realize about it, it is the hallmark of something out of equilibrium, because if you have a system at thermal equilibrium, the interactions of the system can be described as derived from a potential energy. If you have interactions from a potential, the force A exerts on B is minus the force B exerts on A. So it's strictly reciprocal. This problem is something that we've been playing with for a long time, but I'll tell you two manifestations of it in two rather different situations, both of which don't address biology directly. So one is sort of my favorite class of experiments that I've been engaging with in collaboration with Narayanan Menon, more recently with Ajay Sood, and it consists of a system in which you take macroscopic particles, half a centimeter long, and place them in a container like this, side view here, top view here. You vibrate the system up and down, and these particles walk. They do this. So this, you're looking at it from the top, and you're just vibrating something up and down. This particle, because of its shape and because of tilting slightly, is walking. I claim this is actually an honest recreation of self-propulsion, and we have chosen to study these particles as an example of active systems. In this system, what we did in our most recent work, mainly Roshan's PhD work with these other distinguished friends, is to study a collection of these kinds of particles amidst a collection of round particles which just sort of bump up and down and maybe diffuse. What does it like? It's like a collection of motile organisms or motile creatures in the midst of a collection of things that can be moved around but don't autonomously move themselves. And what you find is, as you increase the concentration of the background, keeping these motile agents the same, the system spontaneously organizes into these motile guys forming a row of particles all pointing the same way, which condense the non-motile guys in this manner. Rather more dramatically, I'll show you this movie if I can. Yeah. So this is low background concentration, higher background concentration, much higher. And what you should see is, in this region, these motile particles organize themselves into two rows that condense this much non-motile material. Okay, so I hope that picture was clear. Here is a picture of the end state in a slightly different parameter range. These guys and these guys have created a kind of density phase separation. Dense phase here, low density phase here. Nothing about the interaction of these particles with each other makes them condense. They're just hard spheres. These guys are condensed together only by the action of these agents at the boundary. Okay? The interesting thing is that you can do it in a slightly different geometry and get a similar but maybe even more dramatic phenomenon, which is, again, it's enough if you look at the last panel. You see a row, second panel, sorry. You can see one row of particles pushing a seemingly unbounded, bulldozing a seemingly unbounded row, sort of mass of non-motile particles in front of it. So it looks like you can create something that resembles vapor-liquid phase separation, actually in this case vapor-solid, a dense region, a rarefied region. The only agent that's creating this state is at the interface. When you normally have vapor condensing to liquid, it's because the molecules attract each other. Here, nobody's attracting anybody. They're just being bulldozed into it. And the interesting thing is you get reproducible density contrast between the dense and rarefied phase. So it's not simply an accident of initial conditions or preparation history. So you get something resembling condensation in these systems. So it's a rather novel mechanism for attraction. So we were able to write down, I'll skip these things. The simple verbal qualitative theory is that the motile rods push the beads and create a density gradient. The motile rods have a shape, one end narrow, one end broad. Therefore, purely sterically, they are more easily accommodated in a region in which their nose sits in the high density end and their fat tail in the low density end. So statistically, they are likely to be found disposed with the pointy end in a high density region and the broad end in a low density region. And their motion creates precisely that kind of density gradient. So self-consistently, this positive feedback creates a density gradient which is self-sustaining. It's important to note that this is actually what I was telling you about non-reciprocal interactions in the following sense. If you look at how the rod responds to a bead, the rod likes to point towards regions of high bead density. That means, in a sense, because it points and moves in the direction in which it points, it is as though the rods are attracted to the beads. It's not an actual attraction, but the rod movement is such as to make them move towards the beads. The beads are jostled and pushed by the rods. So the beads are in effect repelled by the rods. So this is not an interaction potential, it's an interaction rule emerging from the dynamics, which is precisely non-reciprocal for a childishly simple reason. So one of the points I want to make is that non-reciprocal interactions are all the rage these days, but in fact the underlying physics can be sort of shockingly simple. Even though it's shockingly simple, its implications are very nice. You get this kind of phase separation. And you can write down, you can do something resembling grown-up physics and maths and write down continuity equations for the densities of the two species, say beads and rods. You can write down a purely diffusive part of the motion plus an active part. You can say if there is a rod polarization in a region, that will give rise to bead motion through the mechanism of pushing. If there is and the rods themselves move themselves as well, and the rods like to point towards high bead density. You can write down a theory of this, which will obligingly have, let me skip all this, an instability at high enough bead concentration and strong enough coupling of high enough tendency of rods to move the beads. It will have an instability of the uniform state with respect to phase condensation of the bead density. So this theory qualitatively works nicely and has the right trends. You can augment it by going to developing things to higher orders and gradients and show that something resembling an interfacial tension also comes out of this, which I will not go into. You can also ask, how much bead material can one row of rods push? And you can again write down a theory of that based on the idea of a concentrated force density of these rods as they move along, and you can solve for the steady state of that problem. And what you'll, excuse me, it's going the wrong way. Yeah. What you will find is that the bead density, if you look if you ask for the bead density in the direction which is being pushed, it has a decay length whose scale is set by how hard it is to compress the beads. So the more packed the beads are, the longer a batch of beads you can push. So in some sense, there's no limit to how much bead material can be pushed by the rods, because this whole mechanism doesn't use the mass, doesn't use inertia in any way. It just uses the kind of pushing that you use to move stuff, heavy material on a floor. So in effect, it suggests that you could get macroscopic phase separation with a submacroscopic quantity of separating agent. We don't know for sure if this is 100% right, but it's tantalizing and we're working on it. Okay, just a few months ago, I was giving a talk on this, and one of my friends in the audience said, you know, this looks an awful lot like something that we've been working on. It turns out they've been working on 2 species of motor proteins, and both of which walk on microtubules in opposite directions in a classic motility assay. The only difference is it's a 2-component, 2 motor species motility assay. And what they find is what is referred to in this trade as microphase separation. That is, you get regions rich in one motor protein, regions rich in another motor protein, separated by rows of microtubules. The difference between this system and ours is primarily that you don't get 2 seemingly unbounded domains, you get stripes of A, stripes of B. But the mechanism is similar in a symmetry sense. The difference is, in our case, the rod-like objects are the motile agents, the medium, the beads are non-motile. Here the motility is not in the extended object. But if you write down, if you stare at the equations, you realize they're very, very similar. So there is, so again, I want to emphasize the importance of doing physics in the way we do it, because you work on a problem on general grounds, looking for generic, non-specific mechanisms, and typically they appear even in the living world. And this is a nice example, I think. Okay, let me tell you. Okay, so let me turn to a completely different non-reciprocal interaction problem. There are models of magnetism in which you have a lattice, and at each side of the lattice you have what you can think of as a little magnetic moment. Okay, there are some models in which that moment is just this way or that way, 2-state. There are other models in which that moment is a 2-component vector, others in which it's a 3-component vector, and so forth. That depends on the symmetry of the magnet in question. Okay, planar spins are a popular problem. So these are 2-dimensional vectors, and the problem of greatest interest is 2-component vectors on a 2-dimensional lattice. This is a famous problem for lots of physics reasons, having to do with topological order and so forth. But the idea is the following. You've got these agents. In a dynamical description, the angle of each of these agents tries to line up with the angle of the neighboring guys through an interaction matrix, Jij, which connects site I to site j. And in all the models we look at here, Jij will connect only nearest neighbors. In the classic models, this Jij is a constant matrix, say +1 or -1 for nearest neighbors and 0 otherwise. Okay? But we got interested in the question of what would happen if the way this vector aligns with its neighboring vector depends on how this vector is pointing with respect to the line, with respect to the bond joining it to its neighboring vector. Now, why would that happen? You can imagine that happening if the interaction wasn't coming from a pair potential, but instead from a signaling interaction. So you've got some kind of antenna or receptor, and you're pointing in a certain direction. Okay? So then you are likely to pick up the signal from that guy. So if there's something being exchanged, then this kind of interaction where the Jij depends on the angle between which way you are pointing and the vector joining you to a neighbor is a totally reasonable thing to look at. So we started playing with this model. This is Pankaj Popli, a postdoc in the group. I should also point out that these planar spin models are closely related to physics-based models that people write down for planar cell polarity. In those models, this non-reciprocal aspect is not routinely taken into account, and I wonder why. I've with some friends, some of whom, at least one of whom is in this building, we've looked a little bit at these kinds of models recently. Let me skip this algebra. The problem of interest is, yeah. So what you can do is you can take this, oh, excuse me, wrong. You can take this dynamics and take a continuum view of it. Don't look at it on a lattice. Look at scales much bigger than the lattice spacing and write down a continuous partial differential equation for the orientation field. And I'll skip the algebra, but if you do a sort of rough and ready continuum limit, what you find is up to second order in gradients, it becomes the equation for a unit vector P, which relaxes by trying to line up with its nearest neighbors in a kind of isotropic way, and in addition has this term which says that if there is a local inhomogeneity in the alignment, the orientation will itself transport it. That is, if at t equals 0, things are kind of largely aligned, but this region has some misalignment, the local mean orientation will transport this misalignment elsewhere. Now, this is very interesting because P is actually not a velocity. It's just which way a given rotor is pointing on a lattice. The signaling type of interaction that we've put in makes P act like a velocity. This term, again, cannot be derived as a derivative of a potential. It makes the P field act like a velocity field. It becomes an equation known as the Toner-2 equation without what that equation normally contains, the density field. There's no mass transport anywhere. There's no agents moving from one place to another. And yet, orientational information transports itself in a directional way. This equation, when augmented with noise, when you include noise, is known to have what is called long-range order in 2 dimensions, which means that if a given vector is pointing this way at low temperatures, the probability that infinitely far away one of the vectors will be pointing the same way is non-zero. That's called long-range order. The same model, if you didn't have this term, is known not to have long-range order, but to have what is called quasi-long-range order, in which in the low temperature phase, without this term, the orientation is highly correlated. The total amount of order on infinite scales is 0, but if I'm pointing this way, the probability that a distance r away, somebody else is pointing the same way, goes down very slowly, only as an inverse power of r. And Kostlitz and Thaler showed that there is this miraculous quasi-long-range ordered phase which has these properties. So what Toner and Tu had shown is that the presence of this term gives you a long-range order. So our question is, have we found a lattice model in which whose non-reciprocal interaction gives you long-range order through the Toner-2 mechanism? It's a very nerdy physics question. There's some prettier, purely qualitative other physics, which I'll show you in a little while. So what we did was to investigate, the true meaning of the continuum limit in this model. And what we did was excuse me again, I'm bad with this. We studied both the nature of order and vortex interactions, which I'll tell you a little bit about. First, let's study the nature of order. The diagnostic of that is to look at the angle fluctuations on larger and larger length scales. One way to do that is to write the angle field in terms of its spatial Fourier components, that is to say as a function of wave vector, which is 2 pi over wavelength with a direction, and look at how the variance of the angle field as a function of wave vector changes as you go to longer and longer wavelengths, that is smaller and smaller wave vector. If that angle field was the angle field of a system that has spontaneously picked one out of a continuum of directions with no lattice bias, then what you should find is that this angle variance as a function of wave vector, wave number, should go down as a power. This is a log-log plot, so a straight line is a power. And so tantalizingly, we seem to see a power law. This is for wave vector perpendicular to the ordering direction, this is parallel to it. But what we see is that at the smallest wave numbers, at the largest scales, the angle variance becomes finite. That the angle variance becomes finite is a dead giveaway that actually the angle, the orientation is anchoring to the lattice directions. So what that means, again, as I said, it's a fairly technical point, is that this rule where you anchor to the lattice directions is inescapable no matter how large a length scale you go to. The angle fluctuations don't wipe out the trace of the presence of a lattice. So there was a bunch of recent work which was quite confused in this regard, and one of the roles of this particular piece of work is simply to clarify what's actually happening. In field theory terms, the angle field gets a mass, okay? So the way to take, so the continuum limit for these fluctuating spin models is tricky. You have to take the statistical continuum limit, shows you the angle field actually has a mass. So if you want this model to create long-range order without lattice artifacts, you have to sort of shuffle the interactions at the unit cell scale in such a way that you don't, and then you can do it. Sorry, again. Another fun and games thing in this problem is topological defects. So what do I mean by those? I mean, here, for instance, is an orientational configuration in which the vector is pointing inward everywhere around a given point. So if you go around this point, as you go around by 2 pi, the orientation also goes around by 2 pi. Okay? And that's something you can't remove. If you had just one of those, you can't remove it unless you change the boundary conditions at infinity. It's topological. Two such objects are known to interact with a potential that depends logarithmically on scale. Their entropy depends logarithmically on scale, and therefore you can ask about a phase transition as you change temperature, and that's what Kosterlitz and Fowlers did. The question is, what happens to that phenomenon in this problem? It turns out that even if you're at very low noise, where the vortices should rebind and the system should stay ordered, if you prepare a pair of vortices, plus sign and minus sign, in this manner, what you find is that at large enough scales, they get cloaked from each other. Let's see if this movie works. So here's a plus and a minus at very low noises. If it weren't for that self-advection, these guys would find each other and annihilate, and you get a perfectly ordered phase. What we show is that the presence of that advection smears the field of this vortex in such a way that this guy basically doesn't see this guy. There's a weird kind of vortex shielding. And the result, depending on the relative orientation of these guys with respect to the background orientation, is that it gives time for new defects to be nucleated. And eventually for a kind of eruption of defects. If you wait for it, it should happen. So even at very low noises, eventually the fact that a stray pair of defects get nucleated, because they don't annihilate, more and more defects get nucleated, and finally the phase destroys itself for essentially for arbitrarily small values of that non-reciprocity. So this is closely connected to findings by Hugh Chate and group a few years ago, directly studying the stochastic PDE of the problem. Okay, one major insight is whether a pair of defects initially put in with a certain separation annihilate each other or hang about forever turns out to depend on a length scale which is governed by the ratio, is governed essentially by the degree of non-reciprocity. So if you look at the equations of motion, you see that this has two gradients, that has one gradient. So the ratio of J to A is a length. That length gets bigger and bigger the smaller you make non-reciprocity. So for any amount of non-reciprocity, there should be a length such that if you put in the two defects farther apart than that length, chances are they should be shielded from each other. And this indeed is what we find. This is the locus of points in the initial separation non-reciprocity plane, such that basically for a given level of non-reciprocity, if you separate the pair initially by a large enough amount, for all practical purposes they fail to annihilate. That makes time for nucleation, that makes time for the phase to be destroyed. So yeah, you can read about this where? here. The paper by Pankaj Ananya Maitra. There are interesting connections to another different problem that we've been studying in magnets with another student, Nisarg and Shubhrata Mukherjee, which will come out soon. Okay, let me come to the, how much time? 2 minutes. Only 2 minutes, okay. So maybe realistically, I'll just tell you very briefly. We looked at a very different class of systems, active systems with positional order, either layers or columns. But I'll tell you mostly about columns. So if you have a system with columnar order, chirality, and internal energy dissipation creating active forces, which speculatively could describe some of the physics inside highly ordered columnar structures such as the axon, we predicted that the mechanics of an array of columns of that sort without mechanical inertia can have oscillatory dynamics, whose so for example, if you could say an in-plane shear of this sort, so simple shear produces pure shear produces simple. These things beat against each other and give you oscillations. And this is oscillations without mechanical inertia. I will not try to explain the physics of that, but instead I'll stop and take questions after just a couple of things. One is my summary, never mind it. There's lots and lots of challenges in this field, including inertia, finding experimental systems with inertia, finding systems which you can control the motion of active matter, including information processing in theories of active systems, including evolutionary processes. And the overall outlook includes many open questions that I just leave you with. So I think I'll stop there and let you ask questions if you have any. Oh, there is. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, I can make two statements of quantum clocking. One is people have taken sort of what are they called? Tight binding models of particles hopping, and introduced a spin variable which also dictates which way they hop. So you have a two-state variable which, rather than just being a spin angular momentum, is actually dictating which way the particles go. There are things about those models we don't understand, and they've sort of modified the dynamics using a what's the bath? Lindblad, that type of, yeah. They've used sort of quantum stochastic dynamics out of equilibrium to claim that you can get one-dimensional flocking order in these models and so forth. It's not very clear what's going on there. We've been looking very hard at it. Even the classical limit of those models is rather weird. There's something with Chandan, Subroto, Narayan back there we are looking at. We have results in part we don't understand. The other point about quantum active matter is, in general, if you take a 2D quantum system, let us say the interface between two bulk leads at different chemical potential, that 2D system is in effect governed by some kind of active matter dynamics. Examples of that include 2DEGs subjected to microwave, Ramesh Mani's work. So there are systems which, on general symmetry grounds, have to correspond to this class of models. Yeah.
So in the systems you talked about initially, these were, there was spherical media, if I understood, and rods.
Right.
But in a cell, you'll have all kinds of different shapes.
Right.
Many different. So will this damp out these effects, or what?
No, the point is, if you've got 4-aft asymmetric polarized objects and they're out of equilibrium, generically they're going to be motile, even if they don't actually have appendages or whatever it is. There's a variety of ways in which it moves. So the other thing is, the degree to which it damps out will also depend on adhesion and other processes. But adhesion is also usually what confers motility on some of these things. I mean, differential adhesion, and then focal, release from the back, moving forward. So it's not necessarily that mere heterogeneity of shape will kill everything. It becomes a question really of looking for a clean experimental system. Basically, what we offer in that first part of the thing is a fairly novel mechanism for phase separation, not using attraction but using motility. And at least one example that seems to look like it is there in the motility assay literature. That's the only statement I'll make with confidence. Right. So ordinary motility by itself can give you phase separation. If you have particles that are moving and take time to change their direction of motion, then if they start moving like in a stampede or a melee, things can get condensed. And if more stuff comes in before these guys have to turn around, the objective criterion for which basically is if the packing fraction times what is called a Peclet number, which is the speed times the persistence time divided by the particle size. If that dimensionless figure of merit is large enough, you will get condensation, again for reasons of motility and not attraction. So that idea seems to be important in liquid-liquid phase separation and phenomena of that sort. This is not that far from that. Here the big difference is the entire phase separating agency is only on the edge. And it looks like an edge can completely alter the physics of a bulk if we're not too far down. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for delivering such a great lecture. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm coming from outside the field, but I can see that especially your self-propagating elongated particle because of asymmetry seems to have a lot of application in medical science, as you said. So are you trying to work with medical researchers and trying to see what kind of implications it can have?
I'll tell you the honest answer to that is no, but I am collaborating with Ambarish Ghosh, who does that kind of physics. Okay. We have a student jointly, Karan Priya, who is just beginning her work. Those are magnetically driven systems, but you could have others.
But can you tell in a couple of sentences what kind of you're thinking of applications?
I would honestly say that I didn't think of any of the applications. In Ambarish's specific work, you want to deliver something to a particular site in a guided way. There are a variety of ways of doing it. I don't want to speak for him, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But it's a more. The point is, given that these particles not only move but can also move other stuff, you can imagine delivering cargo in directed ways. That's one example. Right. We also have other theoretical examples of particles where the motility mechanism is not this vibration, but this again has a connection to this institute in the sense that Ayushman Sen studied particles with half coated with a catalyst immersed in a medium containing a compound that catalyst breaks down. Those objects become self-propelled also. And then you can ask, can those objects do things like chemotaxis because they can respond to gradients? So we've done some work on those problems as well.
Very interesting. Thank you.
So let's thank Sriram again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.